In the world of offshore, one of the hot topics has always been U.S. persons buying offshore insurance and with the promise of tax deferral and build up on a tax-free basis and making lots of money, and none of it will go to the government. Jay and I are to discuss with you today just whether is it the insureds, that is the buyers of these insurance products, who are trying to rip off the government, or is it the promoters, the insurers, who are taking advantage of the insureds themselves. I'm going to first discuss, and what I'm going to use to go through this is a case, cases that Jay and I have been involved in which, separately, quite separately, but they involve the same cast of characters. So the story is going to be going from an insurance company called Zellon to a company called Boston Life to a company called Bancroft, and Jay is going to discuss other insurance companies, insurance cases along those lines. As regards the insureds themselves, many times in the newspapers, though, they're predicted as these poor victims, and they were taken advantage of, and what did they know how to do? And boy, they really had no evil intent, and they're really pictured lily white. Well, in that regard, in a case that I was personally involved in, we wound up taking out of some 57 insureds. We got through 18 of them in deposition, and all the rest, during the course of the case, everybody settled. That is, the insureds wound up settling an abusive process case, and they all wound up paying off. Typical of them, and I'm going to go use for my part of the presentation some of the depositions that we took so that the actual words can be used to tell the story, instead of my just going through some bullet points and just saying this is what happened. I'll use, and if that doesn't, so just for just to show you that we actually had the depots and where it all came from. With regard to the insureds, this was sort of typical of the insured depositions, and we took 18 of them, and they're all, give or take, pretty much the same. Hi, I see from the documents that you're an MD, correct? Yes. Did you produce these documents that I'm going to show you? I guess this is my paperwork for the supplemental disability. What this project was these people who were the insureds, in this case a doctor, bought a supposedly supplemental disability policy from some U.S. guys, U.S. salespeople, who represented that they said some offshore structure of some kind, which was backed up by an insurance company.
As a Zellon case, right?
No, I'm going first with just to lay. I'm going to do the insured first.
Oh, okay.
Are you familiar with the Refund Plus program? Yeah. Who did you speak to initially? I spoke to some guy named Sid Jacobson. Other than Mr. Jacobson, did you speak to anyone else prior? Well, when I can recall, no. When did you first speak with Mr. Jacobson and Unger? It was a couple of years ago. Well, and asked about whether he understood the supplemental policy. He says, basically, from what I know, it's a supplemental disability, so it's not a regular insurance that you buy into. And the plan was that if you put your money in, it covers you. And again, if there's any loss for any reason other than liability, that it's going to pay, and I don't know how much percent of your premium. And if there's no claims in 5 years, you get all your money back. Did you ever have dealings with a gentleman named Denis Kleinfeld? No, not directly. Did you ever have any dealings with a gentleman named Rick May? Not directly. Did you ever have dealings with a gentleman named Leo Ford? Not directly. Did you ever have any indirect communications with Denis Kleinfeld, Leo Ford, or Rick May? Not exactly sure. What part of Boston Life? Do you have any paperwork? I can show you where the Boston Life is there. This is my original papers. Now, what happened in the case, so a little background, we'll get to it, is that all these insureds together filed a lawsuit in Miami, although this was a BVI insurance operation, and sued Kleinfeld, Ford, and May for fraud. which, to fast forward the story, of course, they lost paying substantial compensation for abuse of process. But in the meantime, what is interesting is that a lawsuit was prepared in the name of this doctor, as well as 57 others, and none of them had any dealings with the insurance company or any of the individuals they named. And eventually, when you start taking depositions, they say, did you ever have any dealings with these people? Do you have any paperwork from them? Then why did you sue them? In some of the depositions, we found out that some of the people didn't know that they had actually filed a suit in Miami. A number of them didn't even know who their lawyer was. Doctor, did you receive any policy at all from Boston Life? I'm not sure. Do you recall ever seeing a policy from Boston Life? I'm not sure. Part of your understanding of the Refund Plus program was that you were going to be provided with a supplementary disability insurance that would cover. Is that correct? Yeah, correct. So in that respect, there was an insurance element to the Refund Plus program, right? Yes. From what I understand, it wasn't a regular insurance policy. How much money did you put into the Refund Plus program? I'm not sure if you need to know that. That's probably confidential. This is the plaintiff in an action. We're taking his deposition of a plaintiff in an action, and he's suing me. He was suing the company and 3 individuals for his losses. And what he was told by the lawyer standing there is that, oh, by the way, when they ask you about money, tell you it's confidential. I don't feel comfortable telling you how much that was. If you know then, you shouldn't ask me. Did you produce all the checks you wrote to fund the premiums? I'm not sure what you're trying to ask. Well, I asked for the checks that you wrote in connection with this Refund Plus program. I see the checks here. I probably did. I wouldn't know right now. Let me try to simplify. Did anyone at Boston Life communicate with you that you would be entitled to receive the return of your premium payments into the Refund Plus program? A, that was part of the policy I signed, so I guess it was an implied thing. At least I didn't talk to anybody directly to the BVI. I told you already that's an implied thing from the contract that is signed from the supplemental disability. So yeah, I think there was an indication that you will get your money back if no claims are made. And this was sort of typical of the depositions and typical of the type of insureds that get sold this stuff. Basically what happens is that there's a series of, for what I characterize as professional charlatans, who put together a program, find people like this, and basically they don't really care. In this case, what they bought is they were given a question and answer sheet. They turned over $20,000. They turned over $300,000. They turned over $1 million with not much more. And the promise they had was that the money will go offshore, it'll build up tax-free, you get it all back, and it'll be tax deductible. None of them asked for any other due diligence. None of them saw a policy. None of them had a contract. None of them had any knowledge of who they were, even any due diligence on the companies involved. And that was sort of typical of the mentality of the so-called victims of these schemes. And it makes you wonder who is the victim here? Because we have obviously the United States government saying that these people ripped them off for tax purposes, but it's not their fault. And I leave that up to you to make the decision. But I can tell you that when you talk to these people who are supposed to be victimized, it certainly doesn't raise a great deal of sympathy in your heart when you try and pull out the complete story. So are the insureds ripping off the government on a tax basis? That's something I guess you'll have to think about yourself. Now, as far as whether the insured, the promoters, are ripping off the insureds in these type of schemes, let's start off with a company called Xelan. This is how the story begins. It goes Xelan, Boston, bankrupt. Same cast of characters. Here's how the story builds. In Xelan, eventually, this happened in 2005, after years of investigation. So this goes back, Xelan started in the early 1990s or mid-1990s. And finally, the government shut them down. It was about a $500 million program. Let's see where I go here. This is what? Down, next, where?
Let me try and get out of this.
I just want to go to the next one.
Oh, I don't know if it'll do it like that, but we'll try.
I get to the next one.
Yeah, why don't you describe what Xelan is real quick for the audience? So
All right, why don't you go ahead?
well, Xelan was a program that basically catered to doctors. And Xelan was this deal run out of San Diego by a guy by the name of Dr. Gass. And Dr. Gass, he created a program that offered all sorts of stuff to doctors. Most importantly, he offered them a variety of schemes that they could save money in taxes. The doctors that got into it were all interested in taxes. They all wanted to be Mr. Sophisticated and have some offshore accounts and things, and the Xelan people took advantage of that, and so they came up with a program. A couple of programs, actually. They had a 419 plan, which is a type of welfare program, welfare benefit program, and they had this other insurance program, this disability insurance, and the idea was that you'd pay money into these programs, you'd take a deduction for it, and they would figure out a way to get the money back to you tax-free. And that was really kind of the Xelan was probably the first mass program. There's been somewhat similar scams over the year. In fact, Mark Harris ran a similar scam about the time that he sued David Marchant way back when. But Xelan really was the first the major scheme like this. But anyhow, continue, Dennis.
So now what I have for you is the deposition of George Huff, which was taken in the Boston Life case, of which the Insureds depot I just read to you. Have you heard of a company called Xelan? Yes. What was your involvement in Xelan? For 8 brief months, I was president of one of their subsidiaries. Did Sid Jacobs? Next page. I'm just going to go through the depots then. For those who need copies or something, I'll provide all this to David Marchant on a disc or a flash drive, and he'll make them all available to you.
And you might set this up a little bit. Basically, Jacobson and Huff, one might allege, were sort of salesmen for these groups.
No,
they got pretty deep into the management, at least with Huff.
Did Sid Jacobs work for Xelan? Sid Jacobson was an officer of Xelan. Was he legal counsel for Xelan? He represented both Don Guess and Xelan as general counsel. Sid Jacobson being the one that the insured depot, who I just read, had mentioned in it. Sid Jacobson was an officer and general counsel. How did you meet Sid Jacobson? I knew him for 30 years earlier. Did Xelan have a program similar to Refund Plus? Xelan had a program similar to Refund Plus, and Xelan got in trouble, and they used the structure. But Xelan did get in trouble and used structure. What was the differences? Well, there were some material differences. Next, I have a little sheet that follows that, which is a letter from a law firm here in Miami in 2000 regarding the Global Financial Advisors Network, which is Bradley Barrows, American Benefit Institute, which is George Huff, and American Benefit and another benefit company, George Huff, whereby they engaged this law firm in Miami to give them legal opinions as to the security implications of selling a new offshore insurance product. What was the structure of this going to be? Let me read from you from George Huff's depot. I believe you said you start with the dollar. It emanates from the clients, which you refer to as the G54, the G56, or the G57. This is called the group of. So when you talk about G54, G56, G41, it's the group of this group. And they were introduced by AMRs, which is their, AMRs is the term George Huff used for his sales guys, his representatives. He calls them AMRs.
Associated Membership Representatives. I've heard that a lot during the trial.
Which would be, and they would represent one of three companies. Employers International, a company called Associated Benefits Group, and another company called Strategic Planning Associates. So the risk of the G56 had a direct dealing with the U.S. associations. Yes, they wrote a check only to the U.S. associations. Yes, the U.S. associations, again, Employers International, SPA, that's Strategic, and ABG, then sent money to a company called IAPB. That's the International Association of Professional Benefits, which is a company based in the British Virgin Islands. Correct. Now, this is how this structure gets built. IAPB would then send a commission back. IAPG, in turn, sent money to a company called Dijon Holdings, correct? That was never disclosed. It was to go into a benefit purpose trust, then flow to Boston Life and Annuity. So it is your testimony that you believe that IAPB would send money to a special benefit trust? Yes. What is it? What is it? It's a trust established for the benefit and a specific purpose. ATC was the trustee. ATC originally was the trustee providing services. They did a fine job, no problem with ATC. Later on, ATC retired and Belmont took over. Belmont, at that time, was owned by KPMG and the BVI. So we don't have any problem with the service providers. They've just provided the typical services. And then, as far as due diligence, Sid Jacobson went down, Brad Barrows and Cliff Davids functioned as the chief financial officers. Now, next document is kind of interesting because you wonder, now that we have this structure going up, and you get to these companies, these offshore companies, well, who owns them? That gives us to a deed of indemnity between Brad Barrows, whose name popped up in the George Huff depots, ATC trustees, and company managers, CML. Whereas ATC has agreed to act as trustee of the Benefit Purpose Trust and to act as trustee of the Century Purpose Trust, and CML will act as the director of the International Association of Professional Benefits and as the director of Dijon Holdings Limited, and the person who signs personally and the personal indemnity, unlimited, is Brad Barrows. Now, that leads us to is this working?
It's going to come up. There you go.
So that leads us to, how do we get, I guess this is down here, yeah.
Close that little box.
Close that little box. So how this works. So you get the G57 or the G56 or the G however many number we are. They meet an AMR. The AMR is working for Employers International, which is Huff, Associated Benefits Group, which is Barrows, and Strategic Planning Associates, which is Jacobson. That pays to International Associated Professional Benefits, which is owned by Barrows. That pays to Dijon, which is owned by Barrows. And so you have the international, you have these companies, International Associated Professional Benefit. I'm not getting down all the way, yeah.
I'll do it for you. Or you talk.
And then these are owned by, then these are managed by a special benefits trust, first managed by ATC, and then by Belmont, which was owned by KPMG. So that's how these things get together, these complicated little structures. Did these guys do due diligence? Looks like Perhaps not. How does this case get, how does it get a little thicker? Well, when taking another deposition, question by the lawyer. Did you pay your own way down? This is talking about Brad Barrows. Definitely. I want you to change gears for a second. Previously, we talked about Bancroft Life and Casualty. We pulled up records from the official records. It shows that the shareholder is Associate Benefits Group. Is that correct? I don't believe so. It shows the director, Bradley A. Barrows. Is that correct? You're referring to Bancroft? Bancroft Life and Casualty Limited? Of where? Of BVI. Back when Bancroft was with BVI, the shareholder, I don't believe the Association Benefit had any. Can I see that? Sure. Let me ask you a question first. Bancroft was originally incorporated in the BVI. Yes. Then it moved to St. Lucia. We talked about that yesterday. We have three, by the way, we have 3 volumes of this depot. Explain to me how that happened. You have to ask the lawyers. I don't know. Who are the lawyers? You would have to ask Bancroft's attorneys. Who are Bancroft's attorneys that would have been involved in moving it from one jurisdiction to another? Tom Roberts. Where is he based? Pittsburgh. Was Chesterfield a shareholder? I don't recall. All I can recall is that the program with the insurance company was established under the direction of the FSC. That's the Financial Service Commission. Question, I believe Phil Siegel testified that the shareholder was a trust. Answer, you have to ask Phil. Phil Siegel pops up. Phil Siegel is now, as we can see from the depot, is an owner of Bancroft, of which Brad Barrows is owner of Bancroft, but it's also Brad Barrows involved in Boston Life because Brad Barrows owns Dijon and IAPB, which is the Boston Life case. Boston Life then had, and then IAP, the Employers International, Huff's company has a meeting of some of its AMRs, lawyers and others, none of the G57. It says, I noticed Mr. Hoylman is listed as a speaker. Is that correct? Yes. He also owns a national broker-dealer, and his subject matter was investment. Right. Was he a strategic partner of yours? He represented and ran MHA, which was a securities firm. So his law firm was a broker-dealer? Does he practice law? Sure. Where is he admitted? Massachusetts. So what attracted him to put him on the program for you to speak with the AMRs? Bill was on the board of a previous company. Bill was president of the IAFP, which is now the Financial Planners Association. So we worked together on boards. He served on my board for 5 or 6 years, but as a director. Do you consider him one of your closest friends? Definitely. And have for 35 years? Yes. Now, the interesting part of this, of course, is that when the Boston Life event occurred, in which there was a non-renewal of the policies, Boston Life filed for a declaratory judgment in the BVI as to whether or not the refund should be made or the court or not made. Boston Life was just going to, whatever the court says. What happened was that the G57 hired a lawyer. Who was that lawyer? Bill Hoylman, George Huff's lawyer. George Huff, in turn, hires another lawyer. Who was that? Kieran Fallon. Who was Kieran Fallon? Kieran Fallon is Phil Siegel's business partner and lawyer. They trottle on down and hire BVI counsel, and litigation starts ensuing in the BVI. The result of all this is that Boston Life files for a voluntary liquidation. KPMG is appointed the liquidator. And there it sat, while the liquidator and the lawyers bled the cash out of Boston Life. The windup of the case is that in the BVI, the insureds who had filed essentially a counterclaim to the declaratory lost everything. Unfortunately for them, they had filed a suit in Miami against Boston Life, Kleinfeld, May, and Ford. Kleinfeld took them to task and got settlements on all of them, in which they then had to give up their rights, or at least 29 of them had to give up all their rights in the case. And there, the Boston Life case sits, whether it's sitting in, whether the liquidation is completed or not, we do not know. What happened, though, right after the liquidation is, right before the liquidation, which forces in litigation, which is kind of interesting, is that in the litigation, there were two BVI judges who gave opposite judgments in the case. What happened was one judge in the BVI had a hearing, which went on for quite a long time, in which ultimately Boston Life was given judgment. While that judge was writing her opinion, the BVI counsel for the G57 went to another judge, ex parte, and got a freeze order. So as a result, two BVI judges gave opposite judgments, thereby triggering off the liquidation and thereby triggering the loss to everybody. So what we have here is an interesting scenario that you see offshore. That is, you have insureds who are eager to buy anything. You have promoters who will sell anything. Those promoters go from company to company. What you find is that legal counsel who are represented, like in this case, Hoylman and Fallon, as well as the 20 other lawyers that were involved on their case, never advised the clients that they should be suing Breros, Huff, and Jacobson. What's more is the attorneys in the BVI never filed suit against ATC or Belmont, who have substantial E&O policies. All of them just sat back and bled the cash from Boston Life. In the meantime, Barrows and Siegel trotted off onto a new company called Bancroft Casualty. And I'm going to let Jay pick up the case that he was involved in.
All right. Well, thanks, Dennis. That's a good story. It's a good background. I was a lead counsel on a case, Bancroft Life and Casualty, ICC. That ICC is short for Incorporated Cell Company Limited. They're a St. Lucia company. Bancroft versus Scolari. My client was Caesar Scolari. Basically, my client, somewhere around 2005. Sold a logistics company, and he realized about $50 million in cash from the sales. So he got a pretty good payday on the sale of his company. Well, he's looking around for some ways to mitigate tax. And so he gets hooked up with a Orange County, California lawyer by the name of Matt Brown. Matt Brown had just been to a sales seminar given by Brad Barrows and some of the Bancroft boys, just coming off their Boston Life gig. And they talked Matt Brown into getting my client into the Bancroft program. And the way it worked is this. My client would pay, in the first 2 years, would pay $7 million in premiums to Bancroft for various insurance. When I mean various insurance, it was a lot of insurance that he didn't need. So, for instance, he insured his uniforms for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And, in fact, later in the trial, the judge would comment that, you know, this was nuts because you could have bought completely new uniforms for what you paid in insurance. But the idea wasn't to actually provide insurance. Scolari didn't need insurance at all. But the idea was that it was a tax shelter. He had put money into the Bancroft program. He'd get a current year tax deduction for it. But not just get a deduction. Bancroft agreed to loan him immediately back 70% of his money. So it came out to close to $5 million. So he put $7 million in. He gets $5 million back. So now he has a $2 million that's left with Bancroft, but he gets a $7 million current year deduction. That sounds like a pretty good tax shelter. What was to happen is that he was to go to the end of 5 years, and at the end of 5 years, he was to get a refund of his earned premiums. That is, he was to get a refund of his money less any claims. Well, he didn't really expect any claims, and he didn't end up having any claims. But basically what happened, in a nutshell, is he went down to about the 4th year, and he gets into a squabble with Bancroft as to whether or not he can get his money back or allocated in a certain way. And so then they decide, well, we have the ability to change the premium refund feature. We've decided to unilaterally change it. You're not getting your money back. Oh, by the way, we loaned you $5 million back. Now we're going to call those notes. Those notes have an interest that triggers up to 18%, and there's attorney fees, so now you owe us about $9.5 million. That's what happened to Scolari. So, so I'm his attorney. We go litigate it. The biggest problem we had is that they had St. Lucia form selection clauses in a lot of the documents, and we had to get around that. Fortunately, they'd sued our client in Washington. We were able to make some arguments that we had a defense based on illegality and some other things, and we were able to keep our case from going in whole. Part of it went to St. Lucia, never was litigated, but from going in whole to St. Lucia. And so they were forced to litigate in Washington under Washington state law. We had a 2-week trial after 3 years of just knockdown, drag-out litigation. At the end of the 2-week trial, which was a bench trial, by the way, at the end of the trial, the Judge Layton, having heard all the evidence, came down with a decision. And the decision was, it somewhere in the first page or second page, it says, Bancroft was a scheme, if not a scam. And the court goes on to talk about how what this really was two things. One, Bancroft and Scolari were trying to cheat the government on taxes. And then Bancroft was trying to cheat Scolari out of his money. And so the court held on a theory of in pari delicto that both parties had essentially unclean hands, were trying to enlist the aid of the court to do something unsavory. And so the court basically said, a pox on both of your houses. I'm throwing you both out. You don't get anything. So Scolari doesn't get back the $2 million that Bancroft was holding for him. He loses that. But Bancroft doesn't get back the $9.5 million that they had demanded at trial for the unpaid notes and the interest and the penalties. And that's how the Bancroft case goes. Now, they filed an appeal of that case to the Ninth Circuit, filed it immediately. It was nutty. The fact-finding came out on Friday. They filed by Friday night a notice of appeal, which was really screwy because they gave up some rights in doing so. Nonetheless, they appealed to the Ninth Circuit. It went up to the Ninth Circuit. But after 3 or 4 months, the Bancroft had new counsel, Holland and Knight, that came in. They started looking at it, apparently decided that the chances were good that the Ninth Circuit would give them more of the same. And so they voluntarily dismissed the appeal. So as to my client, his part of the case is over. I will say he's probably going to be in litigation very quickly against Matt Brown, the tax attorney that got him into the deal. This is the Bancroft deal is just one of several programs. There have been 4 or 5 of these programs that I can think of. Dennis has talked to us about the doctor benefit organization, Zalon, out of San Diego, Dr. Guess. And then Boston Life was kind of a curious deal. But there's been a couple other cases that were very similar. One was called Caduceus Life, and Caduceus Life involved a guy by the name of Peter Peggs. And Peter Peggs had a deal where he had an offshore life insurance. It was Caduceus, and people were to pay money to Boston Life or to Caduceus Life. They were going to take a deduction for it. It was for property casualty insurance. Then, by a variety of ways, the money would end up in an unreported offshore trust. The IRS came in, they took the scheme down. It was pretty blatant tax evasion. Peter Peggs was indicted, convicted, and the night before he was to check into federal prison camp, he and his wife went out to the garage, closed the garage door, turned on the car, and committed suicide. That was the Peter Pegg case. Around the same time was the Merrill Scott case, and there was a group out of Utah by the name of Merrill Scott and Associates, and Merrill Scott and Associates had a company by the name of Gibraltar Permanente Insurance. And what they did is it was sort of the same deal. You pay for insurance to our insurance company, you get a current year deduction for it, it moves into the insurance company, and by hook or by crook, we'll figure out some way to get your money back. There was just one catch with the Merrill Scott deal. They were pretty much embezzling the money as quickly as it came in to finance the lifestyle of the people that owned the law firm. And they were actually a law firm up in Utah, not a very reputable law firm, but a law firm that used to advertise in Worth magazine and have these big glossy full-page ads. The long and the short is that that was yet another scheme where people got into a deal. They thought they were going to get a deduction. They moved the money offshore, and their money basically disappeared. Bancroft was a little bit more sophisticated in the sense that they just didn't embezzle the money. They had some contractual arguments as to why they were able to keep it, and that was what was litigated. Bancroft, in fact, made off with quite a bit of money with other insureds in the program, mainly because their counsel didn't get in and contest the choice of law clause, or the forum selection clause, and ended up in St. Lucia, where obviously they weren't going to get any justice for who knows, and they ended up paying Bancroft some pretty good settlements, $2.5 million in one case that the Bancroft boys got to keep to front him. But the deal is that, as Dennis said, who's cheating who here? I've always analyzed or analogized it to how the mob used to shake down bookies, because the bookies were frankly afraid to go to the police, and so they could shake down the bookies all day long because the bookies didn't really have any recourse. And this was very similar. There was always an underlying current of, well, we don't want this to become public because if the IRS picks up on it, you'll lose your deduction. And a lot of people were just quiet. They lost their premium refund. But they didn't want to upset the service. Now, we don't know what's going on with Bancroft in any kind of criminal tax investigation. There was at one point a Department of Justice investigation out there. Of course, the way they work, they're slow as molasses. It took them 7 or 8 years in the Peter Peggs case to get rolling on that.
There was just in the underlying Zalon case in which the IRS came in 2004, a $500 million case. Dr. Guess, who was the principal involved, didn't take a guilty plea until 2010. So when we look at these, when we discuss these cases with clients and be advising them as to either whether they should be buying an offshore insurance policy or not, or B, whether we're representing a offshore insurance company, advising them how to actually set things up correctly. Many people are under the misapprehension that the Internal Revenue Service comes in immediately on every case, and if there's any kind of illegality, they're everywhere and do everything. Jay, what's been your experience as how fast the Internal Revenue Service actually operates in protecting the taxpayers?
Well, I would say that they operate at the speed of a constipated glacier. I think that's about as quick as they go. They're just the Internal Revenue Service is very slow. It's a demoralized organization. I've heard that only 1 out of 3 criminal referrals are picked up by the U.S. Attorney. Now, sometimes what happens, though, is you get somebody in DOJ tax that has a particular interest in a particular area. And there's been a group out of Cincinnati. They were the group that did the Peter Pegg's case. They did a subsequent case I forgot to tell you about, which was the Foster Dunhill case. And the Foster Dunhill case was a very, very similar scheme. Again, you had an offshore insurance company. You had some business protection policies. You had some very dubious insurance that people were buying. That's actually ended up in a indictment of two people, Crithfield and Donaldson, in the Middle District of Florida, and that's a criminal case going on now. But it was a very similar deal. You know, make payments to the insurance company, take a deduction for it, it goes offshore, it stays there. In those cases, Foster Dunhill, the first time I heard that it was under possible criminal investigation was back in 2005, and they didn't indict them until spring of last year. So these deals have they have a long lead time sometimes before anybody actually does anything about it.
In looking over what we can advise you, and I don't mean to keep you from going out and enjoying some sunshine, what can we say to you, and what can we advise you? What I can tell you is that there's a lot of very good insurance companies, and there's a lot in all the offshore jurisdictions. There's a lot of people working very hard to comply with a myriad of law that sometimes is particularly U.S. tax law, which I think was referred to yesterday by Jack Blum as incredibly complex and whose consequences are absurd, if I quote him correctly. So by no means is the fact that some insurance coming from a non-U.S. company overly suspect. On the second note, though, we do have a series of hoops that have to be that need to be jumped through in order for it to qualify. If you're looking for either a tax deduction in the United States or tax deferral in the United States. And in that regard, all we can caution you is that it takes due diligence. This is far more than just making a trip and reading the policies, and it's certainly far more than just accepting a opinion of counsel, even if it comes from a reputable law firm. We had in the Boston Life case a series of opinions written by a very highly regarded international, one of the biggest law firms in the United States. And it really wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And anybody who actually read the opinion itself would immediately say, other than being convinced by the lawyer working at this firm, the opinion itself was actually totally worthless and served no useful basis. And in fact, I think it would, reading that opinion, if you were representing a potential insured, you would say, gee, a red flag just went up. So, Jay, do you have any advice for him?
Well, I think that's exactly right, Dennis. What you see in these deals are opinion letters that are issued to the promoters. And to the extent that the individual insureds can rely on them is a completely different deal. The other thing I would say is if anything's weird out there, and pretty much all these programs were kind of specialized. They had some specialized aspects that you kind of wonder how they got past the regulator in some ways. If you're a regulator, it might be best to call around, and as Dennis suggests, you kind of find out the background of people. Bancroft had some people that had some very interesting background, had been involved in some, shady deals before, to say the least.
And with regard to our experiences in litigating these sorts of cases in the offshore jurisdictions, I can say that on the whole, I am leery at any time of becoming involved in a foreign court in these offshore, in the so-called former tax haven, now current financial centers. There is, not unlike every place in the United States, every little small town or county court or state court, a club. And it's a difficult situation to come in as an outsider, particularly a U.S. person coming into dealing with and actually making a defendant of the locals. And there is a tendency for the local to circle the wagons and protect their own interests. And I have that same feeling, by the way, when I have to go up and litigate a case up in Cook County, Illinois. So it's a matter of always a daunting affair when you're going outside your own jurisdiction, your own territory, your own home court. Any questions about this? These are just a few of the cases that Jay and I have been involved in, of perhaps hundreds. But I thought it would be interesting on a story basis to see how this same cast of characters goes from structure to structure to structure to structure, many of whom are never stopped, but some of whom eventually do get caught. In the meantime, what I can say with some pleasure is that they generate, for Jay and I, an enormous amount of legal fees while they're on the way. And as old lawyers can tell you, bad people make very good clients. Thank you.
True. Yeah, thank you very much.